We gazed into Mexico from the high riverside bluffs in Roma, Texas. Directly across the river was Ciudad Miguel Alemán. Somewhere to the north, lost in the heat-risen haze of the horizon, was Ciudad Mier. That city, one of the historic settlements of the mid-18th century Nuevo Santander colonization, as is Roma itself, claims more than one piece of specifically Texas history. When the Texans decided to stage a counter-invasion of Mexico, in response to post-independence Mexican invasions of the Republic of Texas, a too small and poorly led force, acting against orders from the Republic's own government, was captured and imprisoned in its attempt to capture Ciudad Mier. Following an escape attempt, the prisoners were ordered to draw lots in the form of black and white beans, with those drawing black beans condemned to execution. Supposedly there is a museum in Mier's historic plaza with the Texans' flags and arms, and I would very much like to see it. There is also an Alamo flag on display at Mexico's Castillo Chapultepec and a U.S. Army flag from Buena Vista at the Churubusco Convent, upon which the American visitor may gaze and dream of repatriating, perhaps in exchange for Santa Anna's leg. But I cannot see it, because Ciudad Mier and its environs are firmly under cartel control. In 2010, Los Zetas effectively emptied the town, creating a minor refugee crisis there that spilled into Roma, which was mostly ignored by America's national media, and Mexico's too. Today's civic life is, I am reliably told, back, tenuously sustained by the presence of a sizable unit of the Mexican army. Ciudad Mier is my great-grandmother's hometown. Roma is my grandfather's, her son's. Not far upriver, directly across from Ciudad Mier and in the Texas side community of Fronton, I spoke with a man who showed us a bullet hole in his home's facade and the 7.62 millimeter round that made it. That's Soviet bloc ammunition, usually, for the AK-47. He felt lucky. His neighbor was actually shot in the hip, sitting in his living room with a full .50 caliber round. This would ordinarily be a fatality, but it was on a ballistic trajectory and went through a solid outer and inner wall of the house first. The neighbor also felt lucky. These are Texans, citizens of the United States, in the United States, describing their experiences under fire. What happened to them was fairly straightforward. The Texas Military Department was clearing out the adjacent Rio Grande island of Fronton, and the frustrated cartel men, same ones controlling Mier, expressed that frustration by subjecting this community to indirect fire. Just another day on the border. And that is from The Hard Country, Chapter 2. I'm Joshua Treviño.
Hello everyone, this is Ariana Guajardo joining you on The Hard Country. Today we are continuing our journey through Josh's book, The Hard Country, The Mexican Crisis and America's Answers. And today we're walking through Chapter 2. And Joshua, are you ready to jump into this?
I'm ready, Ariana. Thank you.
First of all, I need to say everyone has to read this chapter. I mean, it really personifies the issue and brings a level of weight to it that I think that we sometimes just forget about whenever we're talking about policy, and we tend to get wonky. But this really shows the humanitarian crisis that's happening at our southern border, and it really focuses on the victims who are actually at the border. So the excerpt that you just read highlights the danger of that people are facing even in America who are like living on that border. And that really caught me off guard. But as we continue through this episode, we're going to be talking about the children specifically who are also caught in the middle.
Yeah.
So let's start with what you just read. So you end that story saying, just another day on the border. So what about that story are people like actually encountering on a daily basis?
You know, there's two competing narratives about border communities, particularly in Texas right now. One narrative, which you see advanced from the left, and which does have some empirical basis to it, holds that border communities are unusually safe. And it depends upon your metric of safety, of course. It is, I think, empirically true and defensible that communities like El Paso, for example, or even Laredo to some extent, are relatively safe. Now, relative is relative when you look at the kind of the ordinary metrics of urban crime. But what you see on the border is simultaneous with that something that's fairly pernicious, which is an insecurity that is fundamentally qualitatively different from the insecurity faced by any other American community anywhere else in the country. It is the Rio Grande frontier, where you do get literally millions across time crossing who are unknown to you. It is the Rio Grande frontier where you can talk to individuals who will tell you stories of being held at gunpoint by traffickers while loads cross. It is the Rio Grande frontier where I can tell you firsthand of people who have had child lookouts cross from the Mexican side and tell them to leave because the trafficking organization on the other side wants to cross over. And it's the Rio Grande frontier where the community of Fronton, which is an informal settlement just north of Roma in the state of Texas.
And that's an island, right? So like what is that community?
Fronton's an island, and the community it's essentially a cluster of houses. It's I don't know if it's technically a colonia or not, but colonia is you're from the valley, so you're familiar with them. But there's sort of these clusters of informal settlements, and they've got names, but no real incorporation or anything like that. Sometimes no infrastructure as well. And Fronton is one of them on the island, and the island itself extends much beyond the community. But it's a major trafficking center. Ciudad Mier, as I mentioned in the text, is a significant regional hub. It's a hub for transportation. It's a hub of settlement. It's a very old city, by the way. It was founded in the 1750s, I believe, if I remember correctly, with the Nuevo Santander settlement. Roma itself is only from 1765, so it's very young. It used to be called Los Saints. These are regardless of the quality of them, they're still American communities, and the fact that they are coming under fire, that they're insecure, that they're subjected to a level of international threat, almost makes irrelevant in a sense, especially for policy purposes. Some of the more traditional crime metrics and stats that we see. All is not well on the border. And if it was, there would be no need for the border infrastructure that we see on the south side of places like El Paso or Laredo or McAllen or Mission or anywhere else.
So there's the island of either Fronton or Fronton, right? Depending on which side you're from.
This is the perennial issue of Spanish words in South Texas.
Yeah, I know. For we have people who are from other parts of Texas who go into work there for border security. Anyway, lots of different ways to pronounce stuff.
Please, Ariana, proceed.
So what happened with the Texas Military Department going in there?
The governor and the Texas Military Department writ large correctly identified Fronton and Fronton Island some time back as an epicenter, essentially a ceded bit of territory, not through any intent, but simply through circumstance that effectively fell under cartel control. And so they very correctly sent in, this is some months back, a surge of personnel in there to clear it out. It was good work. It was necessary work that had to be done. And that's what ended up provoking provoke is probably not the right word, but it ended up incepting, I suppose is a better word, the cartel and direct fire on the community of Fronton, which is essentially an act of, I would say, barbaric frustration on their part. So it continues to be an arena of contention, of law enforcement activity, and just like the rest of the border, it's going to be that way for some time to come. What's interesting is that when you go there, it's really not possible to experience just how thick and almost impassable the vegetation and terrain is there until you're actually there. It is.
And that's on the island itself?
It's on the island itself. Yeah, exactly. And it's concurrent with what you see with a lot of the banks of the Rio Grande, especially when you get essentially south of Laredo. You've got a lot of cane. You've got a lot of brush. You have a lot of these riverine plants that make it very difficult to pass. And it's a trafficker's dream, honestly, because it is quite literally jungle thick in places. And when you go there, even if you're walking a very short distance, which we were in most cases, you've still got the full. It doesn't matter if it's 106 degrees out, which it was when we went. But you've got your full on pants for going through brush. You've got your boots. You've got everything that you would do if you were actually hacking your way through a significant growth in forest. And that's that's the intensity of the terrain and vegetation on the river.
Yeah, but it just was interesting reading that story about someone on American soil, like an American getting shot because of this crisis.
Yeah.
And I've heard so many things about people who are in danger, of course, like on the Mexican side, also in the border communities. Mm-hmm. So I went to a Catholic school through 8th grade. And because of that, we're, in McAllen. And that meant that there were actually some students who lived in Reynosa, but would travel over every day to go to school.
Right.
Because you could do that. It's private school,
it's very
right?
Normal.
It's pretty easy.
Yeah.
But there were a couple of times I remember, especially in elementary while they were still living over there on the Mexican side, they would have to be like, they couldn't come to school because they had to spend the day like laying on the floor of their houses because there were gunshots and just gang violence that was happening outside. And this was around like between 2007, 2010 kind of era. And I think since then their families were able to relocate permanently to the U.S. side. But in that I had heard about where there's like that kind of violence in Mexico. This was kind of a wake-up call to realizing, wait, this is something that's happening to Americans on American soil. And I don't think a lot of people know about that. So I also wanted to go through other ways that kids are caught up in this issue, because it wasn't just people who are living in those communities, but people are being, kids in particular, are threatened on the actual border in the actual river. So you begin the chapter with this story of you're on a boat with a few people in the river. Walk us through that, and what did you see?
Man, it's quite a tale. We're on the Rio Grande, and this was, maybe about 6 months ago. Actually, it wasn't that long ago. But we're on the Rio Grande. We're outside of Reynosa, which is your home area. But as you know, is an epicenter of cartel violence, and it has been. So if you were talking about the incidents you remember being around 2007 or so, that's at the inception of the modern cartel wars, right? Which technically kick off around late 2006, December 2006. And the reason that we're going down the Rio Grande in a boat and staying very, very carefully on the U.S. side, the center line of the river is actually the international border. So we're staying on the north side of that. And what we want to see is all the cartel activity on the south side, and there's a lot to see, especially as you move away from designated landings on the river or bridge crossings or things like that. Like once you get onto the riverine stretches, you see we were followed by cartel lookouts, which is very normal the entire time. Sometimes they'll throw rocks at you. We didn't have that happen on this particular trip. You'll also see a lot of the migrant camps, which are as awful and
the migrant camps are on the south side of the border.
On the south side of the border, yeah.
Waiting to cross over?
They're waiting to cross over, yeah. And they can't enter the river without permission, by the way. If they do, they'll be killed.
By permission from?
From the cartels. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, it's not permission by the legitimate authorities, but by the cartels themselves. They're the ones who meter movement across the river. And so, what we ended up seeing, and in full candor to you and to the viewers, I found this extremely disturbing. I mean, there's a lot of disturbing stuff that happens on the U.S.-Mexico border, and I have seen a lot, but I hadn't really quite seen anything like this. As we ended up going under one of the bridges. I don't think it was Ansalduas, but I'll have to look, see if I can recall which one it was. But it was one of the Reynosa bridges, in effect. And of course, the bridge has pylons that go into the river. And at the base of one of them, on the Mexican side, were two kids. Kids of indeterminate age. They could have been as young as 11. They could have been as old as 15, 16. It was very difficult to say.
But probably young teenagers.
Young teens, probably, I guess. Older middle school, younger high school, I'm not sure. And both Mexicans. And they were asking us on the boat to come near. Please come. Can you help us?
And wait, where were they in the river?
They were about a third of the way across the river.
And they were hanging on to the.
They were standing on one of the one of the kind of the support piles for the bridge, for the international bridge. So they were not in the water, but they had clearly either swum out or were brought out and stayed here. We couldn't really tell which. They weren't wet, which suggests that they'd either been there for a while or somebody had brought them out and left them there. Now the river itself is not particularly big at this point. I wouldn't say it's unswimmable. So it wasn't they weren't at a point in the river where I'd say it was impossible for them to cross back. But at the same time, I wouldn't throw my kids into the Rio Grande and tell them to make it. So my instinct in full candor was, well, let's go get them. Let's pick them up. Let's dump them off on the south side. And it was very interesting. The boatmaster, who had a lot of experience, and was a native of this particular community and stretch of the river, essentially refused to, and not out of any lack of feeling, but what he pointed out was that it was not unknown to use people in distress like that as lures for the bad guys on the South Side. And one of the things that the bad guys on the South Side don't like is American boats, Texas boats going up and down river and observing their activity, especially in this part where there's a lot of encampments, there's a lot of drug activity that goes on. And he basically said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, look, he said, what's the chance that you want to take? He said, these kids are not, they're not in imminent danger of their lives. They're definitely not drowning, so there's not a duty of immediate rescue at hand. On the other hand, if you go up to them and one of them produces a firearm or something like that, like that's the end of your day. And you're not going back to the North Shore. Once you hit the South Shore, there's no guarantees, right? Furthermore, let's say that they did need transport back to the South Shore. There's a bunch of other people on the South Shore, including our cartel lookouts, who had been following us on the South Shore the entire time. And as soon as we went up to that shore, they were going to come get us too. So we went by. We left them. We left them there on the bridge. We passed them heading in one direction, and we passed them again heading in the other direction.
And I remember in the book you point out that at one point you were even the boat captain was tempted to send out extra life, like I guess flotation stuff.
Try to throw them a flotation device, yeah.
And then you guys weren't able to proceed because of you saw, was it Border Patrol that?
Well, this is the catch-22, right? Because there were Border Patrol on the other side, and his calculus, and by the way, I don't sit in judgment on the boatmaster, right?
Yeah.
Like this is a tough call.
Because it was that weird thing where you a piece of you almost fears for their lives because theoretically things could get choppy, and then on the other hand you have to fear literally for your own life.
For your own, yeah. No, that's exactly right. You throw them flotation devices, and then you're liable for aiding an illegal crossing. So what's the right thing to do? The default, and it's a rational and prudent default, but that doesn't mean we have to like it. Is to withdraw and do nothing, and so that is in fact what we did. We did that, and it's something that I've thought a lot about, and I thought a lot about it that night, and I've thought about it since. We probably did the right and prudential thing. We had people with us on the boat who were not, in that particular incident, they were not from Texas, they were not from the area, and so. They were Americans, but I think of them as foreigners anyway. And so getting them into a situation that they didn't anticipate would have been the wrong thing to do, and certainly getting us into a situation where we ended up on the South Bank, and who knows what would have happened after that would have been it could have been catastrophic in its own ways. But it illuminates, I think, the fact that the border is in such terrible shape. The Mexican side is in such terrible shape, and it bleeds over north. And the victims in this case weren't really us. Even if the kids had been bad actors, like let's say the kids did intend to pull a firearm on us or something like that, they're still, in their own way, they're still victims too. Mm-hmm. Because there is an organization backed by a government. This is something that the book is very clear about, that is putting them into this line of work and into this line of literal fire in its way.
And I feel like a lot of Americans, like even me just reading through that, feel really like the weight of that from seeing like really young teenagers put in that kind of position.
Yeah.
But the cartels are exploiting the fact that we have that sort of sensitivity towards them, which is why it wouldn't be unusual for, even if those teens were sincere in their request for help.
Yeah.
There would definitely be another set somewhere else that were bad actors.
The use and trafficking of kids, and this is something that we've talked about on past Hard Country episodes, but I think it's worth emphasizing. The use and trafficking of kids is, of all the disgusting and abhorrent and malevolent things that the cartels and the traffickers do, what they do to children is, to me, the rock bottom worst stuff. And that's really saying something, given the range of their activities and the evils that they commit. But they don't just weaponize kids, they buy and sell them, and they do so at a near industrial scale. It's an evil that needs to be stamped out and eliminated root and branch, in my view.
So in this story, you had started your day, or during the story, we start out on the boat with you. Mm-hmm. Eventually, you're back on land, going through a thicket of sugarcane and trees. And you said you went through an area where you guys were able to tell that hundreds of people had crossed through. There was just like trash everywhere, pieces of clothing. And there was one item that stuck out to you. So what was it that you saw there?
Yeah, I mean, this really I mentioned I'd seen a lot on the border, and one of the things, this will get to what you're asking about. Several years ago, I came across a human trafficking safe house in Presidio County, Texas, which is several hundred miles to the west of what this book chapter talks about. And
Is that another border area?
It's another border
Right.
area, right? So this is the Big Bend area of Texas,
Okay.
and I could find it now. It's almost exactly 30 miles up. I think it's Texas 171 from Presidio.
Okay, so just a farther
Presidio,
north border
Texas.
community. And
Farther
what
north and
happened
west,
else?
yeah, exactly. And the thing that really struck me is that when you go there, I visited. It seems crazy to say I visit this human trafficking safe house, but it's an adobe structure. It's out in the middle there. It's a Chihuahuan Desert Plain that's just north of the Rio Grande, and then you can walk out there and see it. I wouldn't go alone, but if any viewers interested, I'll tell you where it is. Just don't go by yourself and don't go at night. But you walk in there, and what's awful about it is they've got, every time you go, sometimes they change it out, but there's basically a rusted mattress and just women and children's clothing. I mean, God only knows what happens there, but it's nothing good. And you see the bits of clothing. I found like baby shoes there, and I found women's underwear, and there's very little by way of charitable interpretation for what happens at this place. But you go and you see it, and honestly, before getting to what you're asking me about here, I thought it was the most heartbreaking stuff I'd ever seen at the border, because it's the material artifacts of these broken lives that have just been wrecked by trafficking. But what we found in Fronton Island, to me, was even worse. And I write about this in chapter 2. We find this kid's notebook, and it is the children have distinct handwriting, and there was a woman. It was distinctly a woman's handwriting in blue ink, and there were phrases written in it, and the phrases were El nombre de mi padre es Luis, el nombre de mi madre es Flor, el nombre de mi hermano es Juan, el nombre de mi tía, and it went on and on. It had all these names of family members. And
then translation, of course, being the name of my father is Luis, and just like naming all the family members.
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes. I apologize for our monolingual viewers, but yeah, that's exactly right. It was a kid's list of the names of his or her family, and a small child's list of the names of family members. And it was interesting that the guy who was with us, who was local, he was with us, and he had an M4. I'll never forget his disappointment at learning that I was not properly armed to be on the border, which I thought was good common South Texas sense. But it was interesting. He was very dismissive of it, and he said, "Oh, this is a human trafficker note. They're coaching a kid." They're coaching a kid about fake family names.
Wow. But he was just saying that as if it's something he sees all the time.
Yeah, well, he does. He does see it all the time. I had a different interpretation of it. I don't know who's right, and maybe he is the more experienced one. It looked very much to me like a note given to a child by a family member who wasn't going to see the kid again, who wanted them to remember. And it caused me to remember a child that I met who was in Border Patrol custody in 2020. And this little boy was probably about 5 or 6 years old, so about the age of my oldest son. And he'd already been taken into custody, and he was sitting in kind of a room with these other kids who just showed up at the border. They didn't have any adults attached to him. And if you've got small kids, that you can ask small kids basic questions, and the answer is I don't know. Like, I'm not even sure if my kids would be able to say my name right now. It's not that I haven't told them a million times, but and I asked him. I said, so where's your father? And he said, I don't know. And I said, where's he from? Where's your mother? He said, I don't know. What are the names? I don't know. And it's gone. And so when you see stuff like this, it's very easy to imagine a parent who's caught in this web, and because of the way that the trafficking cartels work, it's not unthinkable at all. And in fact, it's far too common for, say, a mother and a child, or a father and a child, or something like that, like a legitimate family, to enter these human trafficking networks, and then the traffickers decide one day that they've got to sell the kid to make a few extra bucks. There's nothing you can do because they'll kill you otherwise, or they'll kill the kid. And to me, it was the single most heartbreaking thing I've ever seen on the border, bar none. Knowing that with this piece of paper and the names of this child's family members, this child who is now probably somewhere in the United States, who knows whether or not he or she is with the family that they ought to be, but a family and a bond that should never have been broken, but was, thanks to the existence of our completely uncontrolled and open border that is ruled only by criminals.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you that just kept coming up whenever I was reading about all these stories that kept striking me is in the background behind all of that is this super well-oiled machine of like this really, it seems almost like a sophisticated organization to be able to traffic, and at this point to at least facilitate the migration of millions of people across the southern border.
Yeah.
And as you've continued to say both in this episode and just in the past, that no one goes across the border without going through the cartels first.
That's right.
And it almost seems to me like they have more control, like they have more control over their side of the border than we do of our side. And potentially, I might even say they have more control of the border than we do, period. Do you think that that's accurate? I think
it's 100% accurate. It's easier for me. And look, again, you're from the Rio Grande Valley. So, the Rio Grande Valley, it's pretty settled. I mean, it's not, I mean, there are rural parts of the Rio Grande Valley, but there's no part of the Rio Grande Valley that's like true wild countryside where you can go for hours.
And even the part that you're talking about at like with the excerpt was like Roma, Rio, that's a little bit less crowded. But,
it's less crowded, yeah.
Mission McAllen are, they're properly functioning cities.
Yes, they are. Yeah, 100%. That's right. And there's plenty of infrastructure there, and there's traffic and things like that. Mm-hmm. I will tell you, I'll put money on this. I will say this in public, and I will stick by it. It is easier for me to go down to the Texas-Mexico border, even in the Rio Grande Valley, and find a cartel man on the south side than it is for me to find an agent of the law on the north side. That's just the reality. That's just the reality. When we put out on the river, for example, aside from the Border Patrol vehicles that we saw actually at the formal port of entry, I laid eyes on lots of cartel people because there were lookouts, again, as I mentioned, following us, and there's cartel infrastructure. Aside from those parked cars on the north side in that one specific spot, I didn't see any U.S. side or even Texas personnel. And it's not because it's electronically monitored, by the way. That's kind of
we're just lacking personnel.
Well, we lack personnel, but more fundamental than that, we lack political will to do what we ought to do and close this off.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you did say that struck me, and I wrote this quote down. You wrote, "Americans will take tactical measures. They'll even take operational ones from time to time, but they won't do the strategic thing to stop the traffic, which would be exceptionally simple in concept. A near impassable physical barrier plus immediate expulsion upon capture."
Correct.
So there is theoretically something that could, I guess, be done that would stop it. But it basically, I guess the point that you're making is that we could stop it. Why don't we go about it that way? Or why don't we choose to?
Well, that's a great question. And a lot of it has to do with just the reigning ideology in Washington, D.C. Look, the state of Texas has probably moved more aggressively than any other entity in the modern age to actually shut down the border. When you look at some of the measures that the state of Texas has taken, building its own border wall, and particularly the riverine barriers that Governor Abbott ordered put in the river over a year ago at this point, I believe.
The giant buoys.
The buoys and the razor wire and yeah, well, I mean, those actually had a real humanitarian effect because they stopped. They stopped crossing where it was implemented. What did the federal government do as soon as it looked like that was effective?
Well, got rid of it.
They moved to get rid of it. Yeah, they challenged it, and they enjoined the state, and so on. And those are all choices that the federal government makes. We have to understand that from an ideological perspective, the left in the United States has talked itself into a position where there is no such thing as unvirtuous migration. There's no legitimate reason to deny anybody entry into the United States. They really do think that. That's why they use terms like undocumented instead of illegal, because they fundamentally don't believe in illegitimacy or illegality in any, qualified in any way when it comes to entry into the United States. They simply think it's basically a human right. And so programmatically, they're going to act accordingly. And they have done that. They really do want to open the border, and they've shown that.
Another thing that I think really highlighted how sophisticated some of their operations were and just how blind the U.S. was. You described seeing tunnels that went under the river. What did that look like?
Yeah.
I did not even know that that was a thing that could be done, let
Right.
alone is happening.
It didn't occur to me. I knew about tunnels under the border, but the tunnels
Right.
under the border that I was familiar with were out in Arizona, for example, where it's a desert. I mean, there's no river barrier. It's genuinely did not occur to me. This is probably why I'd be a bad POW or something like that. It genuinely didn't occur to me that you could tunnel under the Rio Grande. I mean, there's no reason you can't. But as an engineering feat, I would imagine it's fraught with risk because you've got a river atop you. But these cartels have done it. As we proceeded down the river, we saw and had pointed out to us tunnel exits on the north bank that originated somewhere in Mexico, somewhere on the south bank. And these cartelmen, they tunneled under the river. God knows how many lives they sacrificed getting it done, and they pop up on the north bank. And so what ended up happening was that when the tunnels were discovered, law enforcement on our side just filled them with foam. I hope the tunnels were empty when they did that, but they filled them with foam, and so you could actually see like the plume of dried foam coming out of the river where the tunnel exit used to be on the north side. And it really speaks to the ingenuity and the determination and the indefatigability of these cartels and their willingness to create infrastructure to get into America.
Wow. I mean, that was just a crazy thing that I didn't even think of. Like you were saying that you could tunnel under the border, that you could get people across that way. And like you're saying, the fact that the amount of people that could have been lost during that kind of process. But as I was reflecting on that, the question that just kept coming up was something you kind of started with at the beginning of this podcast. You were highlighting Roma and what's the city across from it called?
Ciudad Mier.
Yeah, so these two cities that for a while, like you could probably travel in between. You, like you said, you're a descendant from people who are on either side of that.
Yeah.
They were thriving cities that were not under cartel rule for the longest time.
Yeah.
Do you think we'll ever get back to a peaceful border in the South of the United States?
I hope so. We're nowhere close to it now. Historically, we have had a relatively peaceful border, and this is unfortunate. I don't say this as a prescription, by the way. I just want to look into the camera. I don't say this prescriptively because it's not my hope for Mexico. But you across 200 years, you've gotten a peaceful border when Mexico has been relatively autocratic. And it's had a state that has exercised full control over its territory. That's not inevitably the wave of the future, and I'm certainly not arguing that Mexico needs to revert to an old pre-dictatorship in order to achieve that peace. I'm simply saying that that's what it has taken in the past. Right now, you have a Mexican state that derives too much benefit from cooperation with its own cartels to fully exert itself as the sole executor of sovereignty within Mexico. And until that happens, there's not going to be any peace. It's just the reality of the situation. A good friend of mine, somebody who you actually know because we met with him in Mexico City, once described Mexico to me as what happens when a fundamentally good country is controlled by elites who don't care at all about their own countrymen. And I think that's true right now. And one of the ways in which that absence of caring about their own country expresses itself is in the willingness to tolerate the violence and the tumult that exists on the Texas-Mexico border.
And the use of children, which I feel like we continue to need to emphasize.
And the use of children. Yeah, exactly. There's no depth and depravity that they won't stoop to.
And as we look forward, like through the rest of this book, and presumably getting into some of the solutions and the way that America can answer to defend American citizens and hopefully save children as well, I wanted to reflect on how you ended this second chapter of your book. And the final words that you put is, "The river flows on, and the children of the river cry for help." So I want that to at least remain in the back of our minds while we're talking about we need to solve this crisis in some way.
We do. Because the river is always going to be with us. The border is always going to be with us. And the question is whether or not we make it a place of decency and safety for ourselves, first and foremost, and hopefully for the Mexicans as well.
Well, I'm really looking forward to reading Chapter 3 and going through that with you. Chapter 1 and 2 are already available on the website, hardcountrybook.com. You can also find the link for that in the description. This has been The Hard Country. Josh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ariana.